Well, hello again. Let's just make sure we're setting these up. Hi kids, how are you doing? You alright? Nice of you to come back. Send you a virtual wave, Zoe, Steve. Thank you for sharing. I'll just wait a few more minutes. Let a few more people join if they want to. Hi Jacob. I hope you're staying out of trouble. We're doing chapters 9 to 12 tonight. Roughly 4 chapters a night, I think. Maybe on the Friday I'll do 5. I think this one's quite a short, I don't know if you can see that. It's a shorter amount of reading tonight, so I don't know if I'm going to read more or not. 40 minutes is quite a long time to be talking constantly. And it's the first time I've done it, so that's good. It's been weird, very refreshing actually. Watching one of my friends today, Tom, singing. Hopefully you tuned in on Shenna's post. He just makes it look so effortless. He's so likable, and his music was great. So please check him out, Tom Baker. Go and look at his performance that he did today. It's fantastic. Huge credit to all the effort that's been put into making that happen. It's been brilliant. So like I said, we're going to read chapters 9 to 12 tonight. I've been kind of at the halfway point now as well, and I was thinking I've had lots and lots of positive messages. Like I said yesterday, a lot of people seem to be watching it after I'm doing this bit live. If there's anything you want me to read, next week or whatever, I'm up for that. I think this is something I could definitely get into the habit of doing. Obviously, I mean, it's take 5 days to read this book, and it's not a very long book. If you're reading this inside your head, you probably do this a lot quicker. It's only 180 pages, but split it across 5 days. It's quite long, isn't it? I don't know. I'm up for some requests. If you want me to read anything in particular, I can think about it and I'll try to go away politely. But no, I am genuinely quite up for it. I want to drum up some more interest. I want to make this more of a thing, because I think reading is so important. I'm always telling my kids every single day in class, read more, do some more reading, read all the time, read as much as you can. And that's kind of the point why I'm doing this. I just want to give people a chance to hear a book, share a book, enjoy a book, and hopefully, if one person likes it, then I've done my job. Because we're stuck in the house, we might as well do something useful. And if I can make someone's day that little bit brighter, then I'm up for that. So please share, tag some people in that you think might like it. I know we're kind of halfway through the book, so you know the way that the sharing doesn't quite work as well, because obviously you don't want to share a book that's halfway. That wouldn't be that wouldn't make much sense if someone's just chipped in. Hi Erin. Hi Rebecca. I'm sure Ryan would like to watch. He's more than capable of reading Warhorse. Obviously, don't join the middle bit. Read the ones on the event page, the ones before it, and then catch up. And by the time Friday comes, he's probably on top of up to date. So I've blabbed quite a bit. Thank you to those that are sharing so far. I like that. Like I said, I want to be reaching out. I don't just want to be doing this for a couple of friends on my Facebook. I want this to go out and spread the love of reading. So yeah, keep on sharing, keep on doing that. Right, I'm blabbing. Need to blab for 40 minutes, so that's always good. Oh, thanks, Joe. That's very kind of you. It's not like you to be kind. Ha! I'm just kidding. Joe's lovely, by the way. Very hard working. One of the hardest working TAs in my school. She's brilliant. Mad as box frogs, but is fantastic. Anywho, right, chapter 9. I don't know if you can see that. I keep thinking it's back to front when I look back at it. Right. I need to turn that off because I'm looking at myself. I don't like that. Right. Chapter 9. We were led away by 2 nervous soldiers down farm tracks, through orchards and across a bridge before being tied up beside a hospital tent some miles from where we had been captured. A knot of wounded soldiers gathered around us at once. They patted and stroked us, and I began to whisk my tail with impatience. I was hungry and thirsty and angry, and I had been separated from my troop of Warren. Still, no one seemed to know quite what to do with us until an officer in a long grey coat with a bandage around his head emerged from the tent. He was an immensely tall man, standing a full head higher than anyone around him. The manner of his gait and the way he held himself indicated a man clearly accustomed to wielding authority. A bandage came down over one eye, so he only had half a face visible. As he walked towards us, I saw that he was limping, that one foot was heavily bandaged, and that he needed support of a stick. The soldier sprang back at the approach and stood stiffly to attention. He looked us both over in an undisguised admiration, shaking his head and sighing as he did so. Then he turned to the men. There are hundreds like these dead out on your wire, I tell you, and if we had one jot of courage of these animals, we should be in Paris by now, and not slugging out here in the mud. These 2 horses came through hellfire to get here. They were the only 2 to make it. It was not their fault. They were sent on a fool's errand. They are not circus animals. They are heroes. Do you understand? Heroes. And they should be treated as such. And you stand around and gulp at them. You are none of you badly wounded, and the doctor is far too busy to see you at present. So I want these horses unsaddled, rubbed down, fed and watered at once. They will need oats and hay and a blanket for each of them. Now get moving. The soldiers hurried away, scattering in all directions, and within a few minutes Torpthorne and I were being lavished with all manner of clumsy kindness. None of them had handled a horse before, it seemed, but it did not matter to us, so grateful, for we were all the fodder they brought us and the water. We lacked for nothing that morning, and all the time the tall officer supervised from under the trees, leaning on his stick. From time to time he would come up to us and run his hand along our backs and over our quarters, nodding with his approval and lecturing his men on the finer points of horse breeding as he examined us. After a time he was joined by a man in a white coat who emerged from the tent, his hair dishevelled, his pale face with exhaustion. There was blood on his coat. Headquarters phoned through about the horses, Herr Hauptmann, said the man in white, and they said I am to keep them for the stretcher cases. I know your views on the matter, Hauptmann, but I'm afraid you cannot have them. We need them here desperately, and the way things are going, I fear we will need more. That was just the first attack. There will be more to come. We expect a sustained offence. It will be a long battle. We are the same on both sides. Once we start something, we seem to have to prove a point, and that takes time and lives. We'll all need the ambulance transport we can get, motorised or horse. The tall officer drew himself up to his full height and bristled with indignation. He was a formidable sight, and as he advanced on a man in white. Doctor, you cannot put fine British cavalry horses to pulling carts. Any of our horse regiments, my own regiments of lancers indeed, would be proud, indeed overwhelmed, to have such splendid creatures in their ranks. You cannot do it, Doctor. I will not permit it. Herr Hauptmann, said the doctor patiently. He was clearly not at all intimidated. Do you really imagine that after this morning's madness that either side will be using cavalry again in this war? Can you not understand that we need the transport, Herr Hauptmann? And we need it now. There are men, brave men, German and English, lying out there on stretchers and in the trenches, and at present there's not enough transport to bring them back to the hospital here. Now, do you want them all to die, Herr Hauptmann? Tell me that. Do you want them to die? If these horses could be hitched up to a cart, they could bring back them in the dozens. We do not have enough ambulances to cope, and what we do have break down or get stuck in the mud. Please, Herr Hauptmann, we need your help. The world, said the German officer, shaking his head, the world has gone quite mad. When noble creatures such as these are forced to become beasts of burden, the world has gone mad. But I can see that you are right. I am a lancer, Herr Doctor. But even I know that the men are more important than horses. But you must see to it that you have someone in charge of these two who knows horses. I do not want any dirty-fingered mechanic getting his hands on these two. And you must tell them that they are riding horses. They won't take kindly to pulling carts, no matter how noble the cause. Thank you, Herr Hauptmann, said the doctor. You are most kind. Did it cut out then? Go back. Thank you, Herr Hauptmann, said the doctor. You are most kind, but I have a problem, Herr Hauptmann. As I am sure you will agree, they will need an expert to manage them to start with, particularly if they have never been put in the carts before. The problem is that I only have medical orderlies here. True, one of them has worked with horses on a farm before the war, but to tell you the truth, Herr Hauptmann, I have no one who could manage these two. No one, that is, except you. You are to go to base hospital on the next convoy of the ambulances, but they won't be there for long this evening. I know that's a lot to ask of a wounded man, but you cannot see how desperate I am. The farmer down below has several carts, and I should imagine all the harness you would need. What do you say, Herr Hauptmann? Can you help me? The bandage officer limped back towards us and stroked our noses tenderly. Then he smiled and nodded. Very well. It's a sacrilege, Doctor. A sacrilege, he said. But if it's got to be done, then I'd rather do it myself and see it's done properly. So that same afternoon, after our capture, Torpthorne and I were hitched up side by side to an old hay cart, and with the other officer directing two orderlies, we were driven up through the woods back towards the thunder of gunfire and the wounded that awaited us. Torpthorne was all the time in a great state of alarm, for it was clear he had never pulled before in his life. And at last I was able to turn to help him, to lead, to compensate, and to reassure him. The officer led us at first, limping alongside beside me with a stick, but he was soon confident enough to mount the cart with the two orderlies and take the reins. You've done a bit of this before, my friend, he said. I can tell that. I always knew the British were mad. Now I know that they're used to horses such as you as cart horses, and I'm quite sure of it. That's what this war is all about, my friend. It's about which of us is the madder. And clearly you British started with an advantage. You were mad beforehand. All that afternoon and evening while the battle raged, we trudged up to the lines, loaded up with the stretcher cases and brought them back to the field hospital. It was several miles each way, over the roads and tracks filled with shell holes and littered with corpses of mules and men. The artillery barrage from both sides was continuous. It roared overhead all day as the armies hurled their men at each other across no man's land. and the wounded that could walk back poured across the roads. I had seen the same grey faces looking out from under their helmets somewhere before. All that was different with their uniforms. They were grey now, with red piping, and the helmets were no longer round with a broad rim. It was almost night before the tall officer left us, waving goodbye to us and to the doctor from the back of the ambulance as it bumped its way across the field and out of sight. The doctor turned to the orderlies who had been with us all day. "See to it that they are well cared for, those two," he said. They saved good lives today, those two. Good German lives and good English lives. They deserve the best of care. See to it that they have it." For the first time that night, since we came back to the war, Torpthorne and I had a luxury of a stable. The shed and the farm that lay across the fields from the hospital was emptied of pigs and poultry, and we were led in to find a rack brimming full of sweet hay and buckets of soothing cold water. That night, after we finished our hay, Torpthorne and I were lying down together in the back of a shed. I was half awake, and I could think only of my aching muscles and sore feet. Suddenly the door creaked open, and the stable filled with a flickering orange light. Behind the light were the footsteps. We looked up, and I was seized at that moment with a kind of panic. For a fleeting moment I imagined myself back home in the stable with old Zoe. The dancing light triggered off an alarm in me, reminding me at once of Albert's father. I was on my feet in an instant, and backing away from the light with Torpthorne beside me, protecting me. However, when the voice spoke, it was not the rasping, drunken voice of Albert's father, but rather the soft, gentle tone of a girl's voice, a young girl. I could see now that there were two people behind the light, an old man, a bent old man in rough clothes and clogs, and beside him stood a young girl, her head and shoulders wrapped in a shawl. "There you are, Grandpapa," she said. "I told you they put them here. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful? Oh, can they be mine, Grandpapa? Please, can they be mine?" Chapter 10. Let's have a quick look at the comments. Oh, thank you, Neelam. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you, Karen. Charlie, how are we doing? And Helen and Phil. Hi, Joe. I'm not creeping. Right, chapter 10. If it's possible to be happy in the middle of a nightmare, then Torpthorne and I were happy in that summer. Every day we had to make the same hazardous journeys up to the front line, which in spite of almost continuous offensives and counter-offensives moved only a matter of a few hundred yards in either direction. Hauling our ambulance cart of dying and wounded back from the trenches, we became a familiar sight along the pitted track. More than once we were cheered by marching soldiers as they passed us. Once after we'd plodded on, too tired to be fearful, through a devastating barrage that straddled the road in front of us and behind us, one of the soldiers, with his tunic covered in blood and mud, came and stood by my head and threw his good arm around my neck and kissed me. "Thank you, my friend," he said. "I never thought they would get us out of that hellhole. I found this yesterday and thought about keeping it for myself, but I know where it belongs." And he reached up and hung a muddied ribbon around my neck. There was an iron cross dangling at the end of it. "You have to share it with your friend," he said. "They tell me you're both English. I bet you are the first English in this war to win an iron cross. And the last, I shouldn't wonder." The waiting wounded outside the hospital tent clapped and cheered us to the echo, bringing doctors, nurses and patients running out of the tent to see what there could be to clap about in the midst of all this misery. They hung our iron cross on a nail outside our stable door, and on the rare quiet days when the shelling stopped and we were not needed to make a journey to the front, a few of the few walking wounded would wander down to the hospital, to the farmyard, to visit us. I was puzzled by this adulation, but loved it, thrusting my head over the high stable door whenever I heard them coming to the yard. Side by side, Torpthorne and I would stand at the door to receive our unlimited ration of compliments and adoration, and, of course, this was sometimes accompanied by a welcome gift of perhaps a lump of sugar or an apple. But it was the evenings of that summer that stay so strong in my memory. Often it would not be until dusk that we would clatter into the yard, and there, always waiting by the stable door, would be a quiet little girl and her grandfather who had come to us that first evening. The orderlies simply handed us over into their charge, and that was just as well, for kind as they were, they had no notion about horses. It was little Emily and her grandfather who insisted that they should look after us. They rubbed us down and saw to our sores and bruises. They fed us, watered us, and groomed us, and somehow always found enough straw for a dry, warm bed. Emily made us each a fringe to tie over her eyes to keep the flies from bothering us, and in the warm summer evenings she would lead us out to graze in the meadow below the farmhouse, and stayed with us watching until grazing until her grandfather called us in again. She was a tiny, frail creature, but led us about the farm with complete confidence, chatting all the while about what she'd been doing all day, and about how brave we were and how proud she was of us. As winter came on again, and the grass lost its flavour and goodness, she would climb up into the loft above the stable and throw down her hay for us. As she would lie down on the loft floor looking at us through the trapdoor while we pulled the hay back from the rack and ate it. Then, with her grandfather busying himself about us, she would prattle on merrily about how when she was older and stronger, and when the soldiers had all got home and the war was over, she would ride us herself through the woods, one at a time, she said, and how we would never want anything, if only we would want to stay with her forever. Dropthorne and I were now seasoned campaigners, and it may well have been that drove us on throughout the roar of the shell fire back towards the trenches each morning. But there was more to it than that. For us, it was the hope that we would be back that evening in our stable, and that Emily would be there to comfort us and love us. We had to look forward to that and to long for. Any horse has an instinctive fondness for children, for they speak more softly, and their size preludes any threat. But Emily was special, for she spent every minute she could with us and lavished us with her affection. She would be up late every evening with us, rubbing us down and seeing to our feet, and be up again at dawn to see us properly before the orderlies led us away and hitched us up to the ambulance cart. She would climb the wall by the pond and stand there waving, and although I would never turn around, I knew she would stay there until the road took us out of sight. And then she would be there when we came back in the evening, clasping her hands in excitement as she watched us being unhitched. But one evening, at the onset of winter, she was not there to greet us as usual. We had been worked even harder that day than usual, for the first snows of winter had blocked up the road to the trenches to all but the horse-drawn vehicles, and we had to make twice the number of trips to bring back the wounded. Exhausted, hungry and thirsty, we were led to a stable by Emily's grandfather, who said not a word, but saw to us quickly before hurrying back across the yard to the house. Dropthorne and I spent that evening by the stable door, watching the gentle fall of snow and the flickering light in the farmhouse. We knew something was wrong before the old man came back and told us. He came late at night, his feet crumping the snow. He had made up buckets of hot mash, and we had come to expect, and he sat down on the straw beneath the lantern and watched us eat. "She prays for you," he said, nodding slowly. "Do you know, every night before she goes to bed she prays for you. I've heard her. She prays for her dead father and mother. They were killed only a week after the war began. One shell, that's all it takes. And she prays for her brother that she'll never see again. Just 17, and he doesn't even have a grave. It's as if he never lived, except in our minds. Then she prays for me and for the war to pass by the farm and to leave us alone. And last of all, she prays for you two. She prays for two things. First, that you'll both survive the war and live on to an old, ripe age. And secondly, if you do, she dearly wants to be there with you. She's barely 13, my Emily, and now she's lying up there in her room, and I don't know if she will live to see the morning. The German doctor from the hospital tells me it's pneumonia. He's a good enough doctor, even if he is German. He's done the best. It's up to God now, and so far God hasn't done too well for my family. If she goes, if my Emily dies, then the only light left in my life will be put out." He looked up at us through the heavily wrinkled eyes and wiped tears from his face. "If you can understand anything of what I've said, then pray for her to whatever horse God you pray to. Pray for her like she does for you." It was heavily shelling all that night, and before dawn the next day the orderlies came for us and led out led us out to the snow to be hitched up. There was no sign of Emily nor her grandfather. Pulling the cart through the fresh, uncut snow that morning, Torpthorne and I needed all the strength just to haul an empty cart up to the front line. The snow disguised perfectly in the ruts and the shell holes, so that we found ourselves straining to extricate ourselves from the piled up snow and the sticking mud beneath it. We made it to the front line, but only with the help of 2 orderlies, who jumped out wherever we were in difficulties and turned the wheels over by hand until we were free again and the cart could gather momentum through the snow once more. The field dressing station behind the front line was crowded with wounded, and we had to bring back a heavier load than we'd ever had before. But fortunately, the way back was almost always downhill. Someone suddenly remembered it was Christmas morning, and they sang slow, tuneful carols all the way back. For the most part, they were casualties. Blinded by gas and in their pain, some cried. They sang, for they lost their sight. We made so many journeys that day, and stopped only when the hospital could take no more. It was already a starry night by the time we reached the farm. The shelling had stopped. There were no flares to light up the sky and blot out the stars. All the way along the lane, not a gun fired. Peace had come for one night, one at least. The snow in the yard was crisped by the frost. There was a dancing light in her stable, and Emily's grandfather came out to the snow and took her reins from the orderly. "It's a fine night," he said to us as he led us in. "It's a fine night, and all is well. There's mash and hay and water there for you. I've given you extra tonight, not because it's cold, but because you prayed. You must have prayed to that horse god of yours, because my Emily woke up at lunchtime. Sat up, she did. And do you know the first thing she said? I'll tell you. She said, 'I must get up. Got to get their mash ready for them when they come back. They'll be cold and tired,' she said. The only way that German doctor could get her to stay in bed was to promise you extra rations tonight, and she made him promise to go on with them as long as the cold weather lasted. So go inside, my beauties, and eat your fill. We've all had a Christmas present today, haven't we? All's well, I tell you. All's well." Chapter 11. Get me my throat going as I'm reading this one. Anyway, chapter 11. And all was to stay well for a time at least, for the war suddenly moved away from us that spring. We knew it was not over, for we could still hear distant thunder of guns, and the troops came marching through the farmyard from time to time upwards to the line. But there were fewer wounded now to bring in, and we were needed less and less to pull the ambulance cart back and forth from the trenches. Torpthorne and I were put out to grass in the meadow, by the pond most days, but the evenings were still cold with the occasional frost, and our Emily would also come to us before dark. She did not need to lead us. She had but to call, and we followed. Emily was weak from her illness and coughed a great deal as she fussed around in the stable. From time to time now, she would now heave herself up onto my back, and I would walk so gently around the yard and out onto the meadow with Torpthorne following closely behind. She used no reins on me, no saddle, no bits, no spurs, and sat astride me, not as my mistress, but rather as a friend. Torpthorne was just that much taller and broader than me, and she found it very difficult to mount him, even more difficult to get down. Sometimes she would use me as a stepping stone to Torpthorne, but it was difficult to manoeuvre for her, and more than once she fell off in the attempt. But between Torpthorne and me there was never any jealousy, and he was quite content to plod around beside us and take her on board whenever she felt like it. One evening, when we were out in the meadow sheltering under the chestnut tree from the heat of the new summer sun, when we were heard in the sound of the approaching convoy of lorries coming back from the front. As they came through the farm gate, they called up to us, and we recognised them as the orderlies, nurses and doctors from the field hospital. As the convoy stopped in the yard, we galloped over to the gate by the pond and looked over. Emily and her grandfather emerged from the milking shed, and they were deep in conversation with the doctor. Sorry. Where were we? Emily and her grandfather emerged from the milking shed, and we were deep in conversation with the doctor. Quite suddenly we found ourselves besieged by all the orderlies we had come to know so well. They climbed the fence and patted and smoothed us with great affection. They were exuberant, yet somehow sad at the same time. Amélie was running over towards us and shouting and screaming. I knew it would happen, she said. I knew it. I prayed for it to happen, and it did happen. They don't need you anymore to pull their carts. They're moving the hospital further along the valley. There's a big battle going up there, and so they're moving away from us. But they don't want to take you with them. That kind doctor has told Grandpapa that you can both stay. It's a kind of payment for the cart they used and the food that they took because they were to look after you throughout the winter. He says you can stay at work on the farm until the army needs you again. And they never will. And if they ever did, I'd hide you. We've never let them take you away, will we, Grandpapa? Never, never. And so after a long, sad farewells, the convoy moved away up the road, and in a cloud of dust, and we were left alone in peace with Amélie and her grandfather. The peace was to prove sweet, but short-lived. To my great delight, I found myself once more a farm horse. With Topthorn harnessed up beside me, we were set to work the very next day, cutting and turning the hay. When Amélie protested, after that long first day in the fields, that her grandfather was working us too hard, he put his hands on her shoulders and said, Nonsense, Amélie. They like to work. They need to work. And besides, it's the only way for us to go on living. Amélie is to go on like we did before. The soldiers have gone now. If we pretended hard enough, then maybe the war will go away altogether. We must live as we had always lived, cutting our hay, picking our apples, and tiling our soil. We cannot live as if there would be no tomorrow. We can only live if we can live only if we eat, and all of our food comes from the land. We must work the land if we want to live, and these two must work with us. They don't mind. They like the work. Look at them. Do they look unhappy? For Topthorn, the transition from pulling an ambulance cart to pulling a hay turner was not a difficult one, and he adapted easily. And for me it was a dream. I dreamed many times since I'd left with a farm in Devon. I was working once more with happy, laughing people around me who cared for me. We pulled with the wheel that harvest Topthorn and I, hauling in the heavy hay wagons to the barns where Amélie and her grandfather would unload. And Amélie continued to watch over us lovingly. Every scratch and bruise was tended to at once, and our grandfather was never allowed to work us too long, however much he argued. But the return to the peaceful life from the farm of a farm horse could not last long, not in the middle of a war. The hay was almost gathered in when the soldiers came back again one evening. We were in the stables when we heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats and the rumbling of wheels on the cobbled stones as the column came trotting into the yard. The horses, 6 at a time, were yoked to great heavy guns, and they stood there in their traces, puffing and blowing with exertion. Each pair was ridden by men whose faces were severe and hard under their grey caps. I noticed at once that these were not the gentle orderlies that I had left us only a few short weeks before. Their faces were strange and harsh, and there was a new alarm and urgency in their eyes, for a few of them seemed to laugh or even smile. These were a different breed of men from those that we had seen before. Only one old soldier who drove the ammunition cart came over to stroke us and spoke kindly to little Amélie. After a brief consultation with Amelie's grandfather, the artillery troop bivouacked in our meadow that night, watering the horses in our pond. Topthorn and I were excited by the arrival of new horses and spent all evening with our heads over the stable door, neighing to them. But most of them seemed too tired to reply. Amélie came to us to tell us about the soldiers that evening, and we could only see that she was worried, for she would talk only a whisper. Grandpapa doesn't like them here, she said. He doesn't trust the officer. Says he's got eyes like a wasp, and you can't trust a wasp. But they'll be gone in the morning, and we'll be our own again. Early that morning, as the dark of the night left the sky, a visitor came to our stables. It was a pale, thin man in a dusty uniform who peered over the door to inspect us. He had eyes that stood out of his face in a permanent stare, and he wore a pair of wire-framed spectacles, through which he watched us intently, nodding as he did so. He stood a few minutes and then left. By full light, the artillery troop was drawn up in the yard and ready to move. There was a loud and incessant knocking on the farmhouse door, and we saw Amélie and her grandfather come out to the yard still dressed in their nightclothes. Your horses, monsieur, the bespectacled officer announced boldly. I shall be taking your horses with us. I have one team with only 4 horses, and I need 2 more. They look fine, strong animals, and they will learn quickly. We will be taking them with us." "But how can I work my farm without horses?" Amelie's grandfather said. "They are just farm horses. They won't be able to pull guns." "Sir," said the officer, "there is a war on, and I have to have horses for my guns. I have to take them. What you do on your farm is your own business, but I must have the horses. The army needs them." "But you can't," Emilie cried. "They're my horses. You can't take them. Don't let them, Grandpapa. Don't let them. Please don't let them." The old man shrugged his shoulders sadly. "My child," he said quietly, "what can I do? How could I stop them? Do you suggest that I cut them to pieces with my scythe, or lay about them with my axe? No, my child. We knew it might happen one day, didn't we? We talked about it often enough, didn't we? We knew they would go one day. Now I want no tears in front of these people. You're to be proud and strong like your brother was, and I'll not have you weaken in front of them. Go and say your goodbyes to the horses, Emilie, and be brave." Little Emilie led us back to the back of the stable and slipped our halters on, carefully arranging our manes so that we were not snagged by the rope. She then reached up and put her arm around us, leaning her head into each of us in turn and crying softly. "Come back," she said. "Please come back to me. I shall die if you don't come back." She wiped her eyes and pushed back her hair before opening the stable door and leading us out to the yard. She walked us directly towards the officer and handed over the reins. "I want them back," she said, her voice strong now, almost fierce. "I'm lending them to you. They are my horses. They belong here. Feed them well and look after them well, and make sure you bring them back." And she walked past her grandfather and into the house without even turning around. As we left the farm, hauled unwillingly along behind the ammunition cart, I turned and saw Amelie's grandfather still standing in the yard. He was smiling and waving at us through the tears. Then the rope jerked my neck violently around and jolted me into a trot, and I recalled the time once before when I had been roped up to a cart and dragged away against my will. But at least this time I had my Torkthorn with me. Chapter 12. Chapter 12. Perhaps it was a contrast with the few idyllic months that we had spent with Amelie and her grandfather that made the following so harsh and such a bitter experience for Torkthorn and me. Or perhaps it was just that the war was all the time becoming more terrible. Excuse me. In places now the guns were lined up only a few yards apart for miles and miles, and when they sounded out with their fury, the very earth shook beneath us. The lines of wounded seemed indeterminable now, and the countryside was laid waste for miles behind the trenches. The work itself was certainly no harder than when we had been pulling the ambulance cart, but now we were no longer stabled every night, and of course we no longer had the protection of Amelie to rely on. Suddenly the war was no longer distant. We were back amongst the fearful noise and stench of battle, holding our gun through the mud, urged on and sometimes whipped on by men who displayed little care or interest in our welfare, just so as long as we got the guns there and they had to go. It was not that they were cruel men, but just that they seemed to be driven now by a fearful compulsion that left no room and no time for pleasantness or consideration either for each other or for us. Food was scarcer now. We received our corn ration only spasmodically, and winter came on again, and there was only a meagre hay ration for each of us. One by one we began to lose weight and condition. At the same time the battle seemed to become more furious and prolonged, and we worked together on harder hours, pulling in front of the gun. We were permanently sore and permanently cold. We ended every day covered in a layer of cold, dripping mud that seemed to seep through and chill us to the bones. The gun team was a motley collection of 6 horses. Of the 4, we joined only one and had the height and the strength to pull a gun as a horse should. A great hulk of a horse they called Heaney, who seemed quite unperturbed by all that was going on around him. The rest of the team tried to live up to his example, but only Torkthorn exceeded. Heaney and Torkthorn were quite the leading pair, and I found myself in the traces behind Torkthorn next to a thin, wiry little horse they called Coco. He had a display of white patch marks over his face that often caused amusement amongst the soldiers as we passed by. There was nothing funny about Coco. He had the nastiest temper of any horse that I had ever met, either before or since. When Coco was eating, no one, neither horse nor man, ventured within biting or kicking distance. Behind us was a perfectly matched pair of smaller dun-coloured ponies, with flaxen manes and tails. No one could tell them apart. Even the soldiers referred to them not by name, but by merely the two golden Haflingers. Because they were pretty much invariably friendly, they received much attention, and even a little affection from the gunners. They must have been an incongruous but cheering sight to the tired soldiers as we trotted through the ruined villages up to the front. There was no doubt that they worked as hard as the rest of us, and that in spite of their diminutive size, they were at least equals in our stamina. But in the canter they acted as a brake, slowed us down and spoiled the rhythm of the team. Strangely enough, it was the giant Heaney who showed the first signs of weaknesses. The cold sinking mud and the lack of proper fodder through that appalling winter began to shrink his massive frame and reduced him within months to a poor, skinny-looking creature. So to my delight, and I must confess it, they moved me up to the leading pair with Torpthorn, and Heaney dropped back now to pull alongside little Coco, who had begun the ordeal with little strength and reserve. They both went rapidly downhill until the two of them were only any use for pulling on flat, hard surfaces, and since we scarcely ever travelled over such ground, they were soon of little use in the team, and made the work for the rest of us that much more arduous. Each night we spent in the lines up to our hocks in the freezing mud, in conditions far worse than that of the winter of the war when Torpthorn and I had been cavalry horses. Then each horse had a trooper who did all he could to care for us and comfort us, but now the efficiency of the gun was the first priority, and we came a very poor second. We were mere work horses, and treated as such. The gunners themselves were grey in the face with exhaustion and hunger. Survival was all that mattered to them now. Only the kind old gunner I had noticed that first day when we were taken on from us on the farm had the time to stay with us. He fed us with hard bits of crumbly black bread, and spent more time with us than his fellow soldiers, whom he seemed to avoid all he could. He was an untidy, portly little man who chuckled incessantly and would talk more to himself than anyone else. The effects of the continual exposure, underfeeding and hard work were now apparent in all of us. Few of us had any hair growing on our lower legs, and the skin below was a mass of cracked sores. Even the rugged little Haflingers began to lose condition. Like all the others, I found every step I took now excruciatingly painful, particularly my forelegs, which were cracking badly from the knees downwards. And there was not a horse in the team that was not walking lame. The vets treated us as best as they could, and even the most hard-hearted of the gunners seemed disturbed as our conditions worsened. But there was nothing anyone could do until the mud disappeared. The field vets shook their heads in despair and pulled back those that could rest for recuperation. But some had deteriorated so much that they were led away and shot there and then, after the vet's inspection. Heaney went that way one morning, and we passed him lying in the mud, a collapsed wreck of a horse, and so eventually did Coco, who was hit in his neck by flying shrapnel and had to be destroyed where he lay by the side of the road. No matter how much I disliked him, and he was a vicious beast, it was a piteous and terrible sight to see a fellow creature with whom I had pulled for so long, discarded and forgotten in a ditch. The little Haflingers stayed with us all through the winter, straining their broad backs and pulling against the traces with all the strength they could muster. They were both gentle and kind, with not a shred of aggression in their courteous souls, and Torpthorn and I came to love them dearly. In their turn, they looked up to us for support and friendship, and we both gave willingly. I first noticed that Torpthorn was falling behind when I felt the gun pulling more heavily than before. We were fording a small stream when the wheels of the gun became stuck in the mud. I turned quickly to look at him and saw a sudden labouring and low in his stride. His eyes told me the pain was suffering, and I pulled harder to enable him to ease up. That night, the rain sheeting down relentlessly on our backs, I stood over him as he lay down in the mud. He lay not on his stomach as he always did, but stretched out on his side, lifting his head from time to time as spasms of coughing shook him. He coughed intermittently all night, and slept only fitfully. I worried over him, nuzzling him and licking him to try and keep him warm and to reassure him that he was not alone in his pain. I consoled myself with the thought that no horse I had ever seen with the power and stamina of Torquil, and that I must have a reservoir of great strength to fall back on his sickness. And sure enough, he was up on his feet the next morning before the gunners came to feed us a ration of corn, and although his head hung lower than usual, and he moved only ponderously, I could see that he had the strength to survive, if only he could rest. I noticed, however, that when the vet came that day, checking along the lines, he looked long and hard at Topthorne, and listened carefully to his jest. "He's a strong one," I heard him tell the spectacled officer. I heard him tell the spectacled officer, a man who no one liked, neither horses nor men. "There's a fine breeding here, too, fine perhaps. Herr Major, could well be his undoing. He's too fine to pull a gun. I'd pull him out. But you have no horse to take his place, have you? He'll go on, I suppose, but go easy on him, Herr Major. Take the team now as slow as you can, else you'll have no team, without your team, your gun won't be a lot of use, will it?" "I will have to do what the others do, Herr Doctor," said the Major in a steely voice. "No more and no less. I cannot make exceptions. If you pass him fit, he's fit, and that's that." "He's fit to go on," said the vet reluctantly. But I'm warning you, Herr Major, you must take care." "We do what we can," said the Major dismissively. And to be fair, they did. It was the mud that was killing us one by one. The mud, the lack of shelter, and the lack of food. We're up to chapter 13. Woo! My voice is going. So, thank you for tuning in. I'll read itchy nose as well. Not that you needed to know that. Thanks for tuning in. Tomorrow, 7:30, I will share it around various places. Please feel free to share it. Thank you for watching. It's been great. Thanks.